A quick history lesson. In the early 1900s, oil and gas saved the whales. More specifically, kerosene saved the whales from the brink of extinction. Will the oil and gas industry do it again? We'll talk about that and much more on this episode of The Crude Truth.
In 1901, at Spindletop Hill near Beaumont, the future of Texas changed dramatically as, like a fountain of fortune, thousands of barrels of oil burst from the earth towards the sky. Soon, Detroit would be cranking out Model Ts by the millions, and America was on the move, thanks to the black gold being produced in Texas. Now, more than a century later, the vehicles are different, but nothing else has truly changed. Sure, there may be many other alternative energy sources like wind and solar and electric. But let's be honest, America depends on oil and entrepreneurs. And if the USA is truly going to be independent, it has to know the crude truth.
NAPE is a proud sponsor of The Crude Truth. Be sure to register for the NAPE Expo 2024, February 7th through the 9th at the George R. Brown Convention Center in Houston, Texas. Hurry and register today. NAPE, where deals happen.
This episode is brought to you by LFS Chemistry, committed to being good stewards of the environment and providing the tools so you can be too. NAPE Expo, where deals happen. Air Compressor Solutions. When everything is on the line, Air Compressor Solutions is the dependable choice to keep commercial business powered up. Sandstone Group. Exec Crew. Elevate your network, elevate your knowledge. Oil and Gas Workers Association. Pecos Country Operating. Fueling our future.
Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time of day it is or night. Thank you as always for watching another episode of The Crude Truth. I cannot thank you guys enough. Please send me an email, like, subscribe, leave me only 5-star reviews, of course. But of course, if you have any questions, please send them to me. I'd be more than happy to answer them. Today, I am just so excited. My guest today is somebody that is a warrior, that is actually, in my opinion, an environmentalist warrior, somebody that has been on Jesse Waters, somebody that has been on Tucker Carlson. You might have even seen her documentary with Tucker Carlson called Blown Away, People versus Wind. My guest today is Megan Lapp. Megan, how are you?
I am great. How are you?
Oh my gosh, I am just so excited. Thank you so much for coming on. And you are actually the fisheries liaison at Seafreeze. I want to get that in there as soon as possible.
Yep, that is correct.
Well, now, did I mention every place that you've been to talk about your cause?
No, I have been on Newsmax multiple times.
Mhm.
I've been on Maria Bartiromo on Fox Business. I've been on Martha McCallum's podcast. I've been on a bunch of different radio stations, both, well, really none in my area. There are more other areas. But yeah, there's been a lot of press ever since the whales.
Yes, and what is all this press? Blown away, people versus the wind. Megan, for my listeners out there that are getting a blessing to know you today, what are you doing? And why am I so excited that you're on?
Well, I am a member of the commercial fishing industry of the United States. We provide all of your listeners with fresh U.S. wild-caught seafood. And really, the commercial fishing industry on the East Coast of the United States is under threat of extinction. That's really where we're at. We have millions of acres of our fishing grounds being leased to offshore wind companies, and we are not going to be able to operate in a wind farm. So what's happening is we are losing all the areas that we work, and with really, no meaningful consideration. And so my company is actually the lead plaintiff on the first, on a lawsuit against the first federally permitted offshore wind farm, large scale offshore wind farm called Vineyard Wind. And our case is actually being taken pro bono by the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And so we are fighting hard there, and we're going to see what happens because the federal government has refused to listen to us, put a policy decision over the lives and livelihoods of U.S. citizens. And, we've been forced to resort to the courts.
Now, for everybody that's just not watching but listening to this episode, my face was just so excited when I introduced you and told people that basically, you're here to talk about all the devastation that wind farms are truly doing in the Northeast here in America. And as you started to get into this, I just kind of like got sad, and because what's going on out there is horrific, and I'm just so excited that you are the one that's out there doing the work to let this be known. I mean, people don't know what is going on with these wind farms. I mean, all they know is that whales are washing up on the shores. And as big as that is, just like in my teaser, because whales are an endangered species. Last time I checked, well, a lot of whales species are on the endangered species list. But last time I looked, there's even more to this story than just the whales washing up on shore. And like you just said, the existential threat to the U.S. coastal fishing is no joke, because first of all, without marine life, I would think that life on Earth doesn't exist. Is that correct?
Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot of a lot of your oxygen that you breathe that comes from the ocean, and that primary productivity is actually threatened by offshore wind farms, believe it or not.
You know, people think that these wind farms, that they go up no problem, and that there's all these environmental checks that are done, to make sure they're all safe. Are all the boxes being checked whenever a new wind farm is being developed and built in the ocean?
No, and that's part of the problem. There's going to be a lot of impacts, particularly to species that we harvest, such as squid. Offshore wind farms, as they operate, they generate low frequency noise constant for the life of the project, and vibration, things like that. And squid, in various studies, have been shown to develop lesions, like in their, for lack of a better term, ear cavities, and experience lethal effects from low frequency sound in those kind of same parameters. So, when you start looking at the potential environmental impacts, and species impacts, we have a lot of concerns about that. And I think something that is interesting, as far as review, right? Federal review, because like you said, you would think that there are various fairly rigorous, federal review processes for wind. I know that you guys, are probably used to the federal review process for oil and gas, right?
Correct.
Well, even though oil and gas and offshore wind are regulated by the same federal agency, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, right?
Okay.
There's two totally different processes. And what happens with offshore oil and gas is BOEM will define a larger area, right, for potential leasing. And over 5 years, we'll refine that area down. They will conduct an environmental impact statement. They'll start looking at, what are other conflicting uses, what are potential problems, whatever. And they will take that bigger spot and narrow it down to smaller places, which are leases, and then the leases happen. But for like oil and gas, the analysis happens up front and the area is whittled down. Okay.
Right. Yes.
What happens with offshore wind is that this dates back to the Obama administration. They had a policy called the Smart from the Start policy. And what they did was they started throwing wind leases out in the ocean. They did it in consultation with certain states, whatever state was closest. And I'm like, look, people, this is federal waters, right? Like, we're federally permitted. It's not the states, right? This is federal waters. State wants them in their own state waters, have at it, right? But federally, what they would do is they would consult only with the state that was closest to the project. And then they would cite this lease, and like, it's just thrown out there for every other stakeholder. So, my boats fish anywhere from the Canadian line to North Carolina. Okay. So now all of a sudden we're dealing with like a whole bunch of leases all up and down the coast that were cited. And when they cite them, they would do no environmental review. They'd say, well, we're only gonna issue the lease. They're issuing leases. They're not looking at a big area and narrowing it down to create a lease. They're just issuing leases straight out of the gate. And then they would say, well, we're not going to do a real environmental impact statement because, we're just going to let them survey the air. We're going to let them put a meteorological buoy out there to measure wind. We're not really looking at leasing for a wind farm. So the fishing industry sued the federal government back in like 2017, I want to say, saying that's bullcrap. You know, the reasonably future foreseeable impact of this is a wind farm on the lease area. You guys got to start looking at the impacts now. BOEM said, no, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. We'll consider your interests at the end. So after the developer has signed a speculative power purchase agreement with the state utility, and said, we're going to provide you with, just say, 800 megawatts of wind power, just say. Okay. And then they create a project and a construction plan that will fulfill that 800 megawatt contract. Then they submit that project plan to BOEM. Then BOEM receives it and they say, well, when they develop their environmental review documents, they say, well, the purpose and need for our review is to help the developer fulfill their power purchase agreements with the state, to help the states fulfill their renewable energy goals, and now, you know, to fulfill the Biden administration's executive order that has to do with climate change. So basically, they refuse to analyze any other alternative other than the full build out of the project. They will not reduce it for conflicts with the environment. They will not reduce it for conflicts with fisheries. They will not reduce it for conflicts with like literally anything, because they've said, well, we have to help them meet their power purchase agreement. So when you look at the purpose and need statements, from what I have read for like an oil and gas lease, they'll say, well, a purpose and need for like this action for the environmental review is to balance, you know, environmental considerations with domestic energy production or something along those lines, right? And then that's how they narrow it down. Well, with offshore wind, there's no narrowing it down. It is like a done deal from the day the lease is issued, and the lease is issued with no environmental impact analysis.
That is huge, Megan. Like, so I'm thinking from the offshore oil and gas, you'll start out with an area that may be 9,000 acres. And then you'll get it whittled down to 900 acres. And then you've got to do your environmental impact study before I can even start anything. So you're telling me that with it's the BOEM is the Bureau of
Ocean Energy Management. Yep.
Bureau of Ocean
MMS.
Energy.
They used to be Minerals Management Service. Then they changed their name.
Okay, but what they're doing is they are literally bypassing all of this regulations. Well, not even regulations. All the due diligence of an environmental impact study on this full 9,000 acres. Then it's giving them the go-ahead to develop 9,000 acres worth of wind farms. And the reasoning is because the closest state has already guaranteed that they're going to buy the energy that it produces.
Yeah. And in some cases, it's not even the closest state, because there's a wind lease off the coast of Nantucket, Massachusetts. Okay. And it is obviously closest to Massachusetts. They want to run a 202-mile long export cable to bring the electricity into Queens, New York City. So we have asked before, like, hey, can you guys like try to minimize all the cables, because my boats tow nets that skim the bottom of the ocean. And if we get caught on cables and cable coverings and all these mattresses and stuff that they want to put on there, we destroy our nets. We can actually also put the boat in a very bad safety situation. So we avoid cables, right? And we've been told for years to avoid cables by like the telecommunications company, because everybody's got telecommunications cables. Well, now we're talking about cables with like tens of thousands of volts of electricity in them. And now everybody's like, oh no, it's totally fine. It's totally fine to tow over cables. Don't worry about that. You know, but we've been like, well, why can we not have a spider web of cables? Can we not just have the whole ocean become a spider web of cables? Because BOEM does not analyze the cumulative impact of cables. And yeah, so this project, and we were told before, no, and we've asked, can this lease be moved? Can you move a lease off of a fishing ground, put it in a different spot? No, because we'll lose too much electricity and transmission. But now somehow it is okay to run over 200 miles of export cables from like off the coast of Massachusetts into New York City. And like, that's completely acceptable now.
Well, okay. The safety of the crew on that ship is just thrown out the window. What other kind of dangers are there in safety that you guys have to look out for with all these wind farms and these cables and all these underwater detours, as you will?
So that's a really good question, and this is actually one of the real hardcore bases of our lawsuit.
Okay.
We can't safely operate in a wind farm because each turbine, right? First of all, you have the structure of the turbine, which is bad enough.
Okay.
The base of it has boulders around it, scour protection that they call it, because like if you stood at the ocean and there was waves and the water was sucking past your feet, would kind of make a hole.
Yes, ma'am.
That happens with the turbines. So they put scour protection around the bottom of them.
Okay.
Well, our nets will catch on scour protection. Then they've got cables all in between each one of these turbines. We can catch on cables, right? Cables become unburied over time in the sand. It's the ocean. It's dynamic. Sand moves. Then in places where they can't bury the cable because they're putting it on areas where it's already too rocky, they just chuck more rocks or concrete mattresses on top of it. Now, when my boats are towing a net, that net can be a quarter mile to a half a mile behind the boat, depending on where you're fishing. And then you have the net opened by two hydrofoil steel doors, we call doors. It opens up the mouth of the net, and that is way behind the boat, and it's swinging back and forth in the tide and the currents and wind and things like that. So you have to position the boat where you want it to be so you can position the net where you want it to be, to follow bottom contours, as well as to avoid pre-existing hangs. We have a lot of rocks off the coast of New England. We have a lot of existing hangs, right? And we have to avoid all that because otherwise we can tear up our nets. And now, you can't catch anything if your net's torn up. And then there's time and money and everything to fix that. But also you don't want to get hard hung up on something, especially in areas where there's going to be, tides, or if weather is coming or anything like that, because worst case scenario, you can sink your boat. And things happen very quickly at sea, and, things can get very dangerous. So you're not going to be able to safely fish in the wind farm, because now imagine getting hung up on a cable that's in between two turbines. Now you can't even maneuver your boat to try to get unhung, right? You get smacked with waves, right? Now you're bouncing. Now it's pinball machine time, right? This is very, very safe. And I actually have notices from offshore wind companies from England where they say that trawlers should avoid subsea cables and wind farm infrastructure, because if a trawler snags on it, it can, quote, cause serious risk of loss of life, end quote. But now they come to the United States and they tell us, oh, no, everything is fine. And I recently got some Dutch documents. It was a document that was prepared for literally the Dutch government, where it showed if a trawler fished in a wind farm caught on a cable, what would happen. It was like a comic strip of, here's the boat, here's it catching, here's the boat sinking, now here's the boat at the bottom of the ocean. So this is not like something that I'm making up in my head. Like, this is documented stuff, right? So we can't fish in there. That's a problem. Now, the cables all over the place are a problem. And the other issue is marine vessel radar. So, and I can get into kind of the larger context and world of that later, but basically I started to find out that years ago that offshore wind turbines interfere with radar. You have spinning objects, right? It throws off radar signals, and you can get false targets. You can get, obscuring of real targets. It can become a problem. So our boats operate, at night, in inclement weather, in the fog, in the rain, right? You need radar. Radar is
your instruments. Yes, your instruments are of the utmost. You basically drive your boat.
Drive using the radar. It's kind of like, would you fly in a plane at nighttime if it didn't have radar? Probably not, right? No. It's the same as asking us to you go out in the ocean in our boats with radar that doesn't work, right? Or is compromised. Yeah. So, excuse me, I found this out, started reading UK Coast Guard documents. Yeah. And the UK Coast Guard documents said that at 1.5 nautical miles from turbines, they did an actual test, at sea. They said 1.5 miles from the turbines, they started to experience serious radar degradation. Now, those turbines were only 2 megawatt turbines.
Okay.
Now over on this coast, now we're talking 15 megawatt turbines. We're talking 11 and up. Okay, we're talking about turbines that are now literally over 1,000 feet high and each blade is bigger than a football field. And so I started asking the Coast Guard back years ago. I was like, look, you guys got to do a modeling study, because they had done a modeling study for the Cape Wind project in like 2006 under the Obama administration, and they showed that there would be radar interference. And I said, look, you guys got to update this for like the number of turbines that we have now, or that you're planning, plus the size of them, because that's all going to matter. And then once you actually have an analysis, a radar analysis, a modeling study of this, then we can kind of start talking about navigational safety and navigational impacts of these wind farms, and like have like a logical adult conversation, right?
Right.
So the Coast Guard wouldn't do it, and BOEM wouldn't do it either. And in 2019, I think it was, BOEM, the Coast Guard conducted a Massachusetts, Rhode Island port access route study to see what would be the navigational impacts of like this giant lease area, conglomerate lease area south of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And I implored them. I gave all kinds of data. I gave studies, I gave references, I gave all kinds of stuff. And I said, look, this is what I'm asking. They said, well, we're unaware of any studies that confirm or deny the presence of radar interference because of windmills. And I was like, you guys did a study. That's like totally lying. That's totally disingenuous. But it turned out that before the study was finished, the Coast Guard guy in charge of the study went to become the director of marine affairs for one of the wind developers holding a lease in the area. And that's a problem. It should have been redone. It was not.
Yeah.
And then in 2018, I actually went to Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C. It's like in Virginia, right? So I go there and I met with the chief of the Office of Navigation Systems for the whole Coast Guard, like for America, the United States of America, right?
Right.
And I sat down with her and I started throwing like all these studies on the table. And I'm like, what are you going to do about the radar interference? This is tremendous. This is huge. You have like big ports on the East Coast, right? You have a lot of marine traffic. What are you going to do? And her eyes got really big and she didn't know about any of it. And I was like, how do I know? And you're in charge of marine safety for all US mariners and you don't know. So we started talking about this. And I remember her saying to me, well, you know, they're only going to be 240 feet high. I was like, no, they're going to be 800 to 1,000 feet high. And she didn't know what to say. At the end of the meeting, me and some colleagues I was with, we asked, we were like, well, what should we do? What should our next steps be? And the Coast Guard told us, we literally don't know what to tell you. This is the first we've heard of this. And I'm like, how come I'm the one telling you what the impacts are? And to this day, the Coast Guard has not conducted a study. Okay. And they have not even conducted an analysis on what the impacts to their own vessel capabilities for search and rescue is going to be, because their vessels have the same radar as we have. And when they go out to try to rescue a boat, now imagine this. Now, where do you think the majority of the incidents are going to happen when there's thousands of turbines in the ocean, right? Probably near the turbines. Right. Now, by the time the Coast Guard gets a boat out there, they can't run helicopters down low because now you got 1,000-foot turbines with, you know, blades spinning that are over a football field long. So now what are they going to do if their boats go out there and their boats can't see? And their boats can't do search and rescue because their radars don't work. See the compounding problem? And I'm like, who's in charge?
Right.
BOEM's been in charge, and BOEM just overrides everything else. And obviously, the Coast Guard has been very non-present on this issue. And I've asked multiple times, do a study, do a modeling study. Let's have an adult conversation about this issue. How about you do a study on your own capabilities? Because what are the impacts going to be to your boats? Nothing.
That blows me away. You know, I just think about all the movies and all the real life with an oil and gas rig, which 9 times out of 10, they're steadfast in the ground. And you get helicopters that can go over to them to rescue people, or they'll use them as a place to get people to go to at least hold on to it so they can rescue them. You've just opened up a world here, Megan, to where it's like, you know, I teased in the beginning about the whales, but again, I got to say it again, there's so much more to this than just the whales. You know, the safety alone of Americans that are trying to do their job to provide a service for the rest of us is at stake here. And then when you're talking about the seismic, I guess it's kind of a two-part question is, okay, well, not the seismic, you're talking about radar, excuse me. But you mentioned these wind turbines and how they've got this protective thing around them. Is there any way that sea life is able to exist? And the reason why I ask is when we put in an oil derrick in the ocean, it creates it's not natural, but it creates a reef where you have sea life that comes and it becomes abundant by all these oil and gas old oil rigs. Is there any of that's going on at any of these wind turbines? Like that's a benefit?
Well, you know what? What's interesting is that because of the reef effect in the Gulf,
Yes.
BOEM will always come out and say, oh, don't worry, these will be good for everything because it's going to make a reef effect. Okay.
No way. So they're using the Gulf of Mexico for an example of the Northeast.
Yes. And, my response to that is, look, in the Gulf of Mexico, you have reef fisheries.
Right.
You have reef fish, right? And you have fisheries that go fish hook and line on reefs. Right. That's a different situation. I'm towing a net. And the species that I rely on are typically, they are reliant on sand bottom habitat. And what you're talking about is, having a turbine 1 mile apart in every direction for thousands of square miles. So now what you're doing is you're transforming what used to be sand bottom habitat and you're transforming it to rock habitat. Wow. And so the ecological impact of that is you're completely shifting the environment. We're not talking like one oil rig here and one super far away and one super far away from that. We're not talking about that. We're talking about every mile. Yeah. In every direction. This is now what's happening. And these create underwater low frequency sound. Sound is incredibly important for marine landscapes. They're actually now trying to restore coral reefs by playing the sound of a healthy coral reef on a dying coral reef. That's how important sound is underwater. And that is now, we're going to put low frequency noise constantly all the time. Okay. And electromagnetic fields. All the cables and all these things, they have electromagnetic frequency radiation, right? And fish use the Earth's electromagnetic field to migrate, to do all kinds of, to navigate, all kinds of things like that. So I can say that the Block Island Wind Farm, which is 5 turbines off of Block Island in Rhode Island state waters, that came online in like 2016, and they've had problems with their cables ever since. And they've had problems with them running, all 4 out of the 5 were like broken one summer for months at a time. They had to repair them. Now we've had this summer, one of them was down for like the whole summer. Anyway, that's a different story. But fishermen that I know that used to fish along the cable route, they used to set nets along the cable route before the cable was there. They now no longer fish there. And those fish used to migrate through that area every year, like clockwork, every year, right? And this is where those guys fished. Now the fish will not cross the cable. So now think about the whole ocean being a spider web of electromagnetic fields, and these animals use this to migrate. Excuse me. Those are the kinds of impacts that are very different. Wow. And one quick story that's interesting from, just to jump back to the safety and navigation perspective.
Oh, yes.
One time back in the 90s, Seafreeze had 2 boats that fished in the Gulf of Mexico. We did an experimental fishery in the Gulf of Mexico. And one of my captains told me a story. He said that they were near an oil rig and fishing or whatever, and a rope got caught in the propeller. Okay. And he said they couldn't get it out. They couldn't get the boat. They lost control of the boat, right? Until they could get the rope out of the wheel, right? And he said they came close to floating and just drifting as they're trying to fix the issue, to hitting an oil rig. He said he still wakes up at night with nightmares about that. Now imagine, they want us to be able to just work like no problem in literally thousands of square miles of fixed structure 1 mile apart in every single direction. That's it's even the fixed structure itself, that much of it in our fishing grounds, not okay.
You mentioned the magnetic pulse, or the magnetic, how the fish use the natural Earth magnetic field. What about does the underwater seismic activity that they do have any effect on what's going on with these wind turbines? And is that part of what's going on with these whales that are getting beached up on shore?
So, Can you prove it? No, but the coincidence in time and space is really all you need to look at.
Okay.
So the oil and gas seismic activities, the oil and gas industry.
You're awesome. I was going to ask you about the difference. Yeah, go ahead.
Right?
Yeah.
You guys go and you do it. It is very high intense. It's much more intense than what's being done with wind farms, right? Because you have to go down deeper. Right? However, the difference is, and what's being done on these boats on the East Coast, it is seismic activity. They're only looking down, hundreds of meters, not thousands of meters, right? Because what they're trying to see is what's the seafloor sediments that they can pile drive into it, right? They're not looking for oil, they're looking for stable ground, rocks or whatever the heck. So, but what they do is they go and they map all the area of the leases and export routes and potential export routes. I mean, they're all over the place. And these have proliferated in time and space, particularly in the past couple years. So the difference between the Gulf of Mexico and here is that the Gulf of Mexico, you only have like one species of baleen whale, as far as I'm aware. And it's like, well, now they've separated one of them into like a distinct population segment, but it's very limited in space, right? They're limited in number, they're limited in range. Okay. Now on the East Coast, you literally have a migratory superhighway of multiple species of baleen whales. You have humpback whales, fin whales, endangered North Atlantic right whales, sei whales, minke whales, and they all migrate up and down this corridor. Like imagine a highway, right?
Right.
And that's where they're surveying. So of course the environmental impacts are going to be different because you're in a different environment. Like you don't go moose hunting in Arizona. You go to like Alaska or Maine, right? Because different animals live in different spaces. And that's why the environmental impact stuff is important, because not every place has the same environmental impact, right? Depending on where you go, what lives there. So what they've been doing is they've been doing these surveys. A lot of them now are overlapping. They're overlapping in time and space with, the occurrence of whales, multiple species of whales.
Yes, ma'am.
And the permits, they're only really required to get permits. They don't get permits from BOEM for this. They get what they call incidental take authorizations from NOAA, which is under the authority of the Marine Mammal Protection Act.
Right.
Excuse me. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act states, like, if you're going to incidentally, impact mammals, you have to go through like this application process. They have to review it, etc. Now, the incidental take authorizations that NOAA is issuing to the offshore wind developers for the surveys in particular, they expect that they're going to temporarily deafen whales. They say this. They're going to temporarily deafen them. Now, a deaf whale is a dead whale. Now imagine all of this is happening near the New York shipping lanes.
Oh, right? Man. Yeah.
Think about all the ships. Now, if the whale is deaf, do you think it can get out of the way of the ship? It doesn't even know it's there. No. And this also, how they communicate, how they do all kinds of, things. Sound is very, very important for whales. So now they're allowing the wind developers to temporarily deafen them. They say, well, we don't know how much temporary deafness will lead to permanent deafness for baleen whales, which are the ones that are washing up. And yet they issue it. And the incidental take authorization says, well, if you exceed like these parameters that we've allowed, well, we can pull the permit. Well, how are you going to measure it? You don't even know. You don't even have accurate information on how to measure this, but you already say, well, we expect that they're going to get temporarily deafened. And then all of a sudden you see all these wind farm surveys happening at the same time. And then all of a sudden there's all these dead whales washing up like in unprecedented numbers on the East Coast. And you kind of have to go, okay, like if this was any other activity, nothing else has changed. Remember, nothing else has changed, only the wind farm activity.
Right.
If it was any other industry, if it was any other,
if it was oil and gas, it'd be
everybody going, stop. We gotta hold off. And that's actually what 30 mayors in New Jersey have called for, a moratorium on the surveys until more information can be, looked into. Their congressmen have called for this. There's been all these calls, and yet NOAA, who's issuing the surveys, keeps saying, no, couldn't possibly be the offshore wind surveys. And it's kind of like, really?
Well, first of all, I'm glad to hear that there's mayors and congressmen that are asking for, this to be a moratorium. But where are the groups like the Sierra Club or PETA? Like, where are all these environmentally friendly to the animals, that spend millions of dollars a year on endangered species or on just these different environmental animals that are in impact areas? Are any of those working with you guys on a pro, on a pro or anti wind farm level?
No, unfortunately, and it is very unfortunate. A lot of them have either taken money from wind companies, or I think some of them are just hesitant to say anything about quote unquote renewable energy. Now, there was a coalition of 19 NGOs who wrote a letter to NOAA,
Okay.
stating that they had concerns about impacts to whales from offshore wind activity. Now, that did get out there, and I have seen some other um, letters to NOAA about impacts to endangered whales from
Mhm.
offshore wind activity. NRDC had done one, I believe. And so, that's there, but they have not been vocal with the whale deaths. And
Yeah.
it's kind of like, it is very hypocritical in the sense of, all of these NGOs have been very present with, various other whale initiatives, various other whale meetings, various other, you name it. And it's like, yeah, where are they? Where are they that now this is actually happening? We've never seen this before. I was at a fisheries management council meeting earlier this month. And
Okay.
as I'm sitting there trying to do like my actual job of fisheries regulatory engagement, um, and I'm trying to pay attention to fisheries management measures, I'm getting text messages from a boat that's offshore. And they're like, I see another dead whale. And he's sending me pictures. And I'm like, can you give me, where you're at and, where you're seeing this thing? So he tells me. And so then I start looking, and there's a
Yeah.
Coast Guard notice to mariners of, well, here is the survey boat working for Vineyard Wind Mid Atlantic that's going to be operating in this area during this time. So then you go on, there's a marine tracking website. You can see where boats are, and there's a boat working. It just had started working a couple days prior. Now, magically, there's this dead whale floating that this guy sees. The next day, it hit Long Island. Right near where the guy saw it. It floated into shore. Then, like 2 days later, another dead whale hits. It was either Long Island or New Jersey, and then a day or two after that, another one. So as soon as this boat started operating, within like 5 days, there were 3 dead whales on the New York, New Jersey coastline.
That's
One
not a
was in City Point,
coincidence.
one was in like Long Beach, New York, one was in Long Branch, New Jersey. And they just keep washing up, and it's like the correlation at this point is so obvious. You start looking at how many sea days these survey boats have, and then the rising number of whale deaths, the lines track, and it's like, okay, well, who now is going to do something about this? And what's really interesting?
Huh.
In 2016, NOAA delisted humpback whales from the endangered species list. They said humpback whales are now fine. Okay, this is
Yes.
only 2016. Now, every year, NOAA does they put out documents, they have stock assessments, maybe not every year, but every few years, for whales.
Okay.
And they say, here's the estimated population size, and then they give you a number called PBR, or potential biological removal. And it's how many whales they estimate can be killed through human interaction, and the population still be okay.
Okay.
For humpback whales, that number is 22.
Okay.
We're already from December till now, we're at like about 40 humpback whale deaths for
Now
the
you're
year.
talking about December of 2022
Yeah,
to today,
to now.
which we're
Yeah,
recording here in pretty near September.
9 months.
Less than a year. Yeah.
Yeah, yep, less than
Wow.
a year. We are at like about double what that PBR number is. So then the question becomes, well, if you only took them off the endangered species list in 2016, but now you're seeing these kinds of population level impacts, now what's the next step of the agency going to be?
Yeah.
Because if they relist humpback whales, okay, or put them on, their strategic list, who
Right.
gets smacked with regulations? The fishing industry.
You're
It's not
just
anybody else.
we were talking about that off of pre-meeting about what the effects will do on something else in my industry, and
Right.
you're right there with you.
Yep.
Megan, what you're fighting for is so important, and I know we're running low on time here. How can people donate? How can people get a hold of you and your team to help spread the word that we're really affecting the marine ocean life with these wind farms without doing the proper studies? We're not saying we're against wind energy, but these studies have not been done to give them the green light to be doing what they're doing, for sure. And there's too many coincidences that are going on with marine deaths right now that have to coincide with the wind energy sector.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I encourage people, to start, raising the issue with their elected representatives,
Mhm.
really hammering home that point. If they want to contact me, they can contact me through the Seafreeze website. Our phone numbers are on there. People can feel free to reach out. And, if people also want to get behind, our lawsuit, do publicity for that, they can contact Texas Public Policy Foundation as well.
Okay.
That lawsuit's going to be very precedent setting.
Oh, wow.
And also, I'm also the member of a group called the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance, or RODA, which is a fisheries group that is now nationwide, that is representing fisheries in the face of offshore wind development. And so that is also, it was something that we had to do to pull together very quickly, to try to do something about this. Although
Right.
RODA is also suing because it's also been completely rolled. But those are a few ways.
Golly. Well, Megan, I cannot thank you enough for coming on. I'm definitely going to have you back on to get an update here on what's going on. Just the fact that we've had over 44 deaths of what just the humpback whales, to all these other whales, to all the sea life and the endangerment that mariners are in with this is just horrific. And for you to come on today and give the crude truth, I cannot thank you enough for that. And
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
no problem. Again, guys, this is Megan Lapp of Seafreeze. Please reach out to them. And I just, wow, what an episode. Megan, thank you so much for coming on. And we'll see you here on another episode of The Crude Truth.
Again, thank you to our sponsors, LFS Chemistry, NAPE Expo, Air Compressor Solutions, Exec Crew, Oil and Gas Workers Association, Pecos Country Operating.
The easiest way to start your own podcast and TV show? Real News Communications Network. Stand out from your competition. Produce streams of high-quality social media content. Become a thought leader in your industry. With RNCN, you get to be the host. We handle everything else. Tour one of our 3 locations in Dallas, Fort Worth, and the Colony. Call 972-402-6333 or visit launchashow.com to find out more.